Thank you. My name is Jan Greenberg. I'm a professor here at the School of Social Work. I think this is around the 15th Beebe lecture that I've been involved in. I wanted to just take a few words because today's lecture is in memory of Debra Beebe, who was tragically killed while working in a group home for persons with serious mental illness in 1989. Just a couple years after I began as an assistant professor here at the school. After graduating from Indiana University, Debbie came to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to get her master's degree in social work to specialize in working with people with serious mental illness. And I'm sorry that my voice is cracking, but I'm having memories. Back in that day, in the School of Social Work was known as the Mecca. You were coming to Mecca if you wanted to study serious mental illness. Mary Ann Tess was on the faculty. Mona Wassall, who's here today, was on our faculty. Debbie Allness was on the faculty here. Folks who transformed the system of mental illness around the world. And David LeCount, who's also here today, was running the Dane County mental health system and was just instrumental in everything that was occurring at that time. Debbie was in Mona's field unit. You couldn't escape Mona's field unit in serious mental illness. And one of Debbie's projects was finding shelters and food for homeless people in the Madison area, and so that they would not freeze during the winter time. Debbie she liked to bring her dog with her to the shelters, and she was known, Debbie was she was smaller than me, so she was little, and she always would bring her big dog to the shelters, and she was known as a little girl with a big dog by the clients. She worked at the shelter, also the halfway house for Goodwill Industries. The clients and staff loved her. She made special birthday cakes, she planned parties, she helped with costumes and anything else that could make life better for clients. And that day we called really good social work. On January 6, 1989, she had just come on to her shift at the halfway house. There was a client there who kind of refused to take his medication. And he stabbed Debbie. He stabbed her several times. There was a coworker. The coworker called the police. This client who stabbed her ran to a telephone booth and called the police and said, he told the police what had happened and to come and help her. Okay, but by the time any help arrived, she had passed. I think we can all, anybody who's a parent can just imagine the rage and pain this family felt with Debbie's tragic death at the age of 27. And it would have been quite understandable, at least from my perspective, if they turned this grief into calls for a new building of state institutions and locking people up with serious mental illness. But Debbie was passionate about working with clients with serious mental illness who are living in the community, and her family wanted to honor that passion and her commitment and have her spirit and her passion live on in others. So they established the Debra Beebe Scholarship for social work graduate students who shared Debbie's commitment to working to improve the quality of life of people with severe and persistent mental illness. I think to date, I know well over 60 scholarships have been given over the years. And these scholarships recipients, through their social work careers, have touched the lives of literally thousands of persons with serious mental illness and really worked to improve their quality of their lives. I know that Debbie would be extremely proud of her family and how they have really, through establishing this scholarship, they really acted to improve the lives of people with serious mental illness. So we thank their family very much. I'm going to now turn it over to Lauren Bishop Fitzpatrick, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
So thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my doctoral mentor, Dr. Sean E. David E. Epperson Professor of Social Work and Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh. So a clinical social worker by training, Dr. Eek is an exceptionally productive scholar with over 200 articles, books, chapters, and conference presentations to his credit. In addition, his work has garnered many millions of dollars in federal funding, and he has used this funding to continuously push the envelope on schizophrenia research and treatment. His presentation today will focus on cognitive remediation in schizophrenia and on an intervention, cognitive enhancement therapy, which is a highly successful and innovative intervention for patients with schizophrenia. But his contributions to the field extend far beyond this. One of the most innovative aspects of his work is the way in which he integrates biopsychosocial model of social work into his work through the neuroimaging work that he does. And his work ethic and devotion to patient care are truly exceptional, and he's an excellent and dedicated mentor and teacher, and I can say that from personal experience. It's been my pleasure to call him a mentor throughout my career, and I'm excited that you will all get to hear some of his great knowledge today, and he will be able to share it with you. So thank you for coming today, and I want to introduce Sean Eek.
Thanks so much, Lauren, Jen, for having me here. It's an honor to be giving the Beebe lecture this year. I understand that I'm one of the younger individuals to be able to do this in his career, and it's an honor to be able to do this at this time in my career with the things that we have going on in our work. I think it's relevant to what Beebe had started to dedicate her life to, and sadly it was cut short, but we continue this struggle and this fight for better treatment, and particularly better community treatment for people with severe and persistent mental illness. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that with people with schizophrenia and cognitive remediation in an intervention we call cognitive enhancement therapy. You guys hearing me okay? Yeah? No. Okay. Thank you. I'm so glad somebody spoke up. Thank you. If I happen to trail off, which doesn't usually happen, but if I do, just raise your hand and remind me, please. Okay. I'll be talking about cognitive remediation in schizophrenia today, and I'm going to this is a new field. This is really a very new field. It's become incredibly popular in serious mental illness, in schizophrenia in particular, but also in bipolar disorder, in autism, in ADHD, in a variety of conditions. This new approach called cognitive remediation has been used. And we're going to look at it with a bit of a skeptical eye and a little bit of an eye to the future about where we might take things and how we might best leverage this technology, if you will, to try and improve meaningful outcomes for people with schizophrenia who are living in the community. These are my disclosures. I currently don't have any financial conflicts of interest, although I have research support from the NIMH. Now, this is probably an unnecessary slide for this audience, but it is one that I like to begin my work with and my talks with because many people still wonder why social work is involved with schizophrenia. I know, it's odd, especially in Madison, nobody wonders this. But in fact, for those of you who may not know the history of our involvement and the involvement of our profession with people living with schizophrenia, it's been extensive and highly significant. Social work has pioneered and championed the development of psychosocial interventions for people with schizophrenia for over 50 years. I mean, the work that has been done, starting really formally, I think, with Jerry Hogarty's work in major role therapy, Marianne Test's work on Hospital Without Walls and assertive community treatment, social skills training, Carol Anderson's work on family psychoed. These were all people in schools of social work and social workers leading the effort to try to really push the envelope on psychosocial interventions, on that people with schizophrenia need more than just medicine to get better, that medicine is a foundation, but it is not the end of building a good quality of life. It's just the beginning, in fact. And this is really what so many of our social work champions who've come before me have really pushed and done. And this is what I'd like us to understand, this new field of cognitive remediation in this historical context. So many of these interventions that were developed by our social work colleagues were by and large helping individuals with schizophrenia who were often heavily institutionalized to live in the community, right? So this is what assertive community treatment really did for a lot of people, was to make even the most severely ill individuals, the people that were most severely disabled by this condition, you could still live in the community and have a meaningful community engagement. Much of the work that came after that had to do with, once people were in the community, how do you keep them from having to go back to the hospital, prevent relapse, prevent psychosis, prevent other types of problems that would send people back into an institution. This work has made it possible for us to now focus on something beyond the institution, all right? This work has matured for so many years. There must be over 100 trials of assertive community treatment now, all showing the benefits of that intervention. Now we can start to focus beyond the hospital, and now that people are living in the community, how do we help them flourish? How do we help them really recover? And what are the targets we need to be focusing on? I'm here to try to convince you that at least one of the targets, it will not be the be-all, end-all target. It's not the only thing that needs treated. There's no magic bullet to treating schizophrenia. It's a comprehensive condition. It calls for a comprehensive approach. But at least one of the challenges has been fairly unaddressed in the treatment literature is problems in thinking and cognition in schizophrenia. And this is no surprise to clinicians in the audience. People who've worked with people with schizophrenia and the people themselves who experience this condition know it takes a heavy toll on your thinking, on your brain, on your ability to stay organized, on your ability to focus. And this is a graph showing various areas of cognition, various areas of thinking in people with schizophrenia relative to healthy individuals, people who don't have this condition. And you can see healthy individuals are standardized at 0, so 0 is kind of our baseline point. And you can see here almost every domain you measure in schizophrenia, you find about a standard deviation impairment in some domain, ranging from basic memory and problem solving all the way to an area called social cognition, which has to do with understanding and processing social information in others. It's a very fundamental area that we'll get into in a minute. Anybody in the room have children? School-age children, perhaps? Right? So I think about this. I think about this cognitive profile that the people we serve have and the challenges they have. And I think about the educational system, and I think, if my son or daughter brought home a reading test and was one standard deviation below their peers in that reading test, there would be significant cause for concern. There would be major alarm. Now imagine every test you gave her. She was performing a standard deviation below her peers. This would not surprisingly make it very difficult to succeed in school, work, and other adult roles as individuals grow up and live their lives. These are some cartoon examples of, you need memory to do a job, right? So if your surgeon can't remember where he's operating or where she's operating, you're having big trouble, right? Well, my first job wasn't a surgeon, it was at McDonald's. Okay? And even that job took a lot of working memory. You had to remember what went on first, the bun, the meat, the patty. You had to remember all the components that went on that. Darn near anything you want to do in terms of productive work is going to require memory. Okay? And so if you have challenges with that, that's a big barrier to work. That's a big barrier to community life and adjustment. At the same time, the challenges people with schizophrenia experience aren't all basic memory problems. They're very social in nature. Many of them are very social in nature. There are difficulties in what we call social cognition. This is an example of Bob. Bob is proposing to, I'm assuming this is his girlfriend, partner, and it says, while she's wearing a shirt that says no means no, and at the bottom it says Bob's timing is a little bit off, okay? It's a cartoon example about missing a social cue, okay? A very concrete social cue. And what I like to remind people is, while this is comical and interesting, it is not all that different than the concrete social cues the people we work with often miss. And they come away from social situations feeling like they didn't do the right thing, like they weren't heard, like they weren't understood, and it's very demoralizing. As a consequence, many people with this condition have significant social anxiety, for good reason. They've had a lot of negative social interactions before. And so the challenges we're trying to treat and address in cognition in people living with schizophrenia range just in enormous magnitude and breadth, from basic difficulties in information processing to major problems in understanding others and understanding and picking up social cues. Here's what we know about treatment and what treatment will do for these challenges. So these are effect size graphs. I've labeled small, medium, and large. And these are the largest and some of the newest studies of compounds and antipsychotic medications for the treatment of cognition in schizophrenia. You can see that this is the CATIE trial. This is the largest non-industry funded trial in the United States of antipsychotic treatment. You can see the effect size of an antipsychotic, any given antipsychotic, is about 0.2 standard deviations above the mean. That's not large, that's not clinically significant, and if you're working against a standard deviation, not 0.2 of a standard deviation, it's only a budge. Right? We had hoped that some of the newer glutamatergic agents would be more effective at treating some of these problems, both in negative symptoms and cognition in schizophrenia, but every single compound that they have tested has failed. The only one that has come close is an alpha-7 nicotinic receptor agonist, which is very interesting because has anybody noticed how much people with schizophrenia smoke? It's a lot. It's a lot. Well, that alpha-7 nicotinic agonist is kind of might be doing the same thing as cigarettes doing, okay? There's possibly, although there's horrendous physical health benefits associated with smoking, there's possibly pro-cognitive effects associated with this, which may be why people with schizophrenia end up smoking cigarettes as much as they do, as an effort to cope against some of these cognitive challenges, which appear to be relatively untreated by the existing medications and even the newer ones that are available. So what's a social worker to do, right? We don't have any medicine for this. Everything else is coming up short. But there has been this family of approaches that has been available outside of mental health, outside of psychiatry for many, many years, called cognitive remediation. It originally started in traumatic brain injury, and I'll give you a little bit of history on that in a minute. But the basic idea behind cognitive remediation is that we all have a brain, and that brain, once affected, does not necessarily mean it's permanently affected, right? That if a brain becomes damaged, it could be improved. That if a brain has an illness or is affected even by a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, that perhaps it might be able to repair itself. Basic scientists and animal studies have told us that the brain is far more capable of reorganizing, regenerating, and repair than we had previously thought. The term schizophrenia was always associated, 1980s and before, with static encephalopathy, right? Which means a static brain disorder. Once you have it, it's not improving, okay? What kind of message is that for the people that we serve? Well, we're learning more and more in basic science that message isn't even factually true. That in fact, the principles of neuroplasticity can in fact improve the way the brain works. The question is exactly how. That's the science we're knee-deep into and trying to figure out. The hope is that if we could provide the right kind of experiences, whatever those may be, that we'll be able to improve the brain in conditions that are largely affected, have a major neural and brain component like schizophrenia does. You can think about cognitive remediation as a bit of an exercise for your brain, right? So if you missed all that, I tried to be as scientific as I could. It's a workout for your brain, if you take nothing else out of it. That's what cognitive remediation really is, okay? This is the first study to show brain plasticity in humans. It was published, I think, in Nature in '95, only a couple of years after fMRI was invented. And what they did is they had individuals, healthy individuals, normal individuals, coming in to learn how to play piano sequences. And as they played more complex piano, anybody play piano in the room? It's not an easy instrument. It is not an easy instrument. It requires a lot of practice. It requires a lot of coordination. It requires a lot of fine motor movement and fine motor skills. And what they found was when these healthy individuals, I presume college students, were learning to play the piano, their motor cortex grew. Not only in size, but also in magnitude of activation. So learning, just something simple, I don't know if I'd say piano is simple, but something like learning the piano can really grow our brain and change our brain fundamentally. Could we use these types of principles to help treat schizophrenia, where it has a fundamental challenge in thinking and processing information? Before we get into exactly how these have been used in people with schizophrenia, it's important to know that there's a major distinction in approaches. Everybody here has probably heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, all right? This is a family of approaches developed by Aaron Beck and his colleagues, and although it has cognitive in the title, it has nothing to do with cognitive remediation, okay? Cognitive behavioral therapy largely has to do with changing the way you think about things. Not exactly how good you can attend to them or remember them, but how you interpret them in some way, okay? Cognitive remediation is actually trying to boost these cognitive challenges to some degree. There's another family of approaches, though, that has emerged that you should be aware of. It's become very effective. It's been pioneered by Don Veligan's group in Texas. It's called Compensatory Approaches. It's called Cognitive Adaptation Training, or CAT. It falls under this compensatory category where, okay, let's take it as a premise that people with schizophrenia have cognitive challenges, as they tell us that they do, as we observe, as clinicians observe. Let's try to build the environment to minimize those cognitive challenges as best we can, okay? So this is reminders, aids, putting things in sequences, clothing bundles, the types of things that you can do to avoid using cognition more, right? And avoid the cognitive challenges that these individuals experience. This has been incredibly helpful for enhancing medication compliance and adherence, as it turns out. Something that's always a challenge for people with this condition, and as medicines, people are often very ambivalent about. The other type of approach to cognitive remediation, though, is a restorative approach, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, okay? The idea that we can not only change the environment so that it doesn't affect people as much who have cognitive disability, but that we also might be able to enhance cognition so that that disability is not as great, okay? And the environment may need less adaptation to their needs as you might expect. So here's some examples, easy examples of compensatory approaches. Here's a nice little cartoon. You go into a seminar, how to improve your memory, come out with a bunch of Post-it notes, all right, so you won't forget things. Using checklists, using sequence lists for people in the shower, in the bathroom, for basic daily living skills. They sound basic, but they're not. The impact is significant. Many people have trouble with these types of things. Many people need this level of support. And so that this is available and tested in multiple randomized trials now and proven to be effective is something to attend to. It's just not something we're going to talk a lot about in this talk. Okay. On the other hand, a restorative approach doesn't really use environmental aids much as a compensatory approach might use. A restorative approach uses drill and practice, repeated practice of an exercise that's designed to challenge some area of your thinking, whether it's attention, memory, or problem solving. The focus is on promoting your ability to understand your own cognitive strengths and limitations. We all have them. And so awareness of them is essential for planning your life, for planning the environments you want to go into, and for planning what you think you will succeed at. But it's not all basic cognition, it's very social as well. Fewer individuals, fewer groups have studied social cognition and tried to intervene on it. We have. I'll show you some examples of it. But generally, you want to do the same thing with social cognition as you're doing with memory. Give people social exercises they can use to work out different areas of the social brain. Now, is this a common term, knowledge term in this room? Do people know there is a social brain now? Like there's certain areas of your brain that are specifically dedicated to observing faces and picking up social cues and understanding that you have a mind and that I have a mind and that our minds can be different, right? These are fundamentally challenged in people who have schizophrenia. And imagine if you couldn't do these things in your life, how hard it would be to make friends, how hard it would be to succeed in social situations, to do well at work. So these restorative approaches are not about modifying the environment. Quite frankly, they're about modifying the brain. Traditionally, these approaches were not computer-based. You'll see some computer-based approaches today. But traditionally, you can do these in all kinds of ways. You can play Sudoku, there's memory exercises, there's crossword puzzles. All of these have been shown to have some minimal cognitive benefit in some way or another. The idea is that you're keeping your brain active and you're repeatedly practicing it. The computer-based approaches that have been developed in this area have just become a little bit more precise, I think. They actually haven't become very fun, or it's not like playing Xbox, right? It's more like going to the gym and lifting a barbell, right? So you know you're doing something good, you know something's happening, and the goal is that improvement. The task and exercise itself isn't always terribly intrinsically rewarding. There's a lot of new online sites. You probably have even seen some commercials for some of these places. I've listed some of the ones that we use and some of the ones that other people use. Anybody here seen the Lumosity commercial? Was that advertised here? Yeah. So this is out. This is available. I list that, although that's one of the few ones that doesn't have an evidence base behind it yet. It's interesting how things appear in commercials far before the science is settled on them. Regardless, PSS Cog Rehab is a piece of software that was developed for people with traumatic brain injury, and it's one that we actually use in people living with schizophrenia. Has a strong evidence base. Posit Science is now called Brain HQ, also has a very strong evidence base in people with serious mental illness, particularly schizophrenia. Happy Neuron and Think Now are two emerging programs that you can look at. I have no financial affiliation with any of these. I'm not on the board of any of these companies. We just think some of the software they use is very, very good, and we think it could be helpful for people with this condition. So what do we know about cognitive remediation in people living with schizophrenia? Well, one thing you might not know is there's been darn near 40 randomized trials of this. A lot of study, especially in the last decade, but it's been going on for some time now. And overall, you're not supposed to really read this, but you're supposed to get a sense that most of the studies have shown a pro-cognitive benefit, right? There's been some null-finding studies, some prominent ones, and some well-designed ones. But most of the studies that have examined cognitive remediation as a practice, and I'll say, these 38 studies all have 38 different versions of cognitive remediation. That's about how many we have. It's a challenge for us in this field. But they've all, regardless of the unique ways that they've been doing it, they all have shown that this will improve cognition in people living with schizophrenia. And that not only will it improve cognition, it will also significantly improve functional recovery and outcome, right? That's the key goal. Remember, we got to this idea, this target of cognition, because we think it limits people's ability to succeed in the community, to get employed, to keep a job, so on and so forth. Well, this meta-analytic review that was published, I think it was 2011, suggested that overall, there appears to be a clear benefit for these types of interventions for people with schizophrenia. And so the evidence base is emerging. It's not as strong as assertive community treatment or family psychoeducation, which now has hundreds of trials, but it certainly is emerging. It's something I think we all should take notice of. Many states are very interested in implementing these practices. As soon as SAMHSA put aside the 10% set aside for first episode schizophrenia, we received calls from almost all the states about how to do cognitive remediation because this is a practice that people are very interested in. You'll see in a minute why we think it might be particularly effective for young people, for people in the early phase of schizophrenia. Well, I told you there's 38 different types of cognitive remediation interventions. Well, here's ours. Here's one of them. It's called cognitive enhancement therapy. It was developed by my late mentor, Jerry Hogarty, who was very fond of many of the people that Jan spoke about here today, a good colleague and an immense contributor to the psychosocial treatment of people living with this condition. He developed this in the mid-90s and then did the first trials, which published in the early 2000s. And what cognitive enhancement therapy, CET, is it's a two-phased approach. It matches what we feel like are the two issues cognitively people with schizophrenia have challenge in. The first part of it is focused on basic problems in cognition, attention, memory, problem solving, okay? How do we improve focus? How do we improve working memory? How do we help people be more cognitively flexible and plan ahead to solve problems? Okay? That's what the first part is about. And all of that is done on a computer. And I'll show you an example of a computer game in a minute, where it's a basic memory exercise. The idea behind these computer games is we start at a level where you can be successful, and then we gradually increase the difficulty. And we have always been able, when Jerry first wrote these grants in the mid-90s, they were rejected. The field said people with schizophrenia cannot do this. You cannot increase the difficulty level of cognitive exercises, and they won't improve They can't learn these types of things. Well, the field was very wrong in that regard. We've now treated, must be 500 individuals with schizophrenia now over the course of these studies, and they're able to do everything we throw at them and more. I mean, it's amazing. People with this condition are able to learn. They're able to get fast. They're able to improve their memory. They're able to problem solve. They're able to do some of these exercises better than I can, okay? And so the first thing we learned, I think really the first thing Jerry learned right out of the gate was we do not give the individuals we serve enough credit for their capabilities. And we need to see more strengths and capabilities in them than deficits. The second aspect of CET speaks to the social challenges people with schizophrenia have. And none of us believe we can address these social challenges by sitting in front of a computer and playing a game, okay? We need a group, we need a social setting, and that's what we run in CET. It's a small group, it's a small social cognitive group, and it focuses on things like taking the perspective of other people, picking up emotions and faces, reading social cues, being foresightful, and so on and so forth. This is an 18-month treatment program. This is the longest cognitive remediation intervention available for people with schizophrenia. If you look at the evidence base, it also might be one of the most effective. We feel like, based on our prior work, many individuals with this condition who've been living with these cognitive challenges for many, many years are not going to benefit from a couple of sessions. That prolonged support, but not indefinite. You graduate from CET, you don't do this forever, right? But prolonged and sustained support is more realistic to help individuals really have a significant functional gain from these types of programs. It's been an important mantra that we've been trying to tell everybody who will listen, because the field is rapidly moving in the other direction, towards short, couple sessions, interventions, which do improve cognition to some degree, but they do not improve functional recovery, which is the end goal, and we cannot forget that. Neurocognitive training focuses on these three domains: attention, memory, and problem solving. I'm going to speed through them a little bit so I can show you some of our data. This is a slide I knew wasn't going to work, so this is my backup slide. That does work, right? So I have this is a game that was supposed to work on one of our cognitive exercises, but it stopped working on most laptops a long time ago. So this is a still picture of what this game looks like, okay? This is a memory game. This is one of the simple memory games that we work on in cognitive enhancement therapy. You press start, and some of these shapes will pop up in the screen here for a few seconds, and then the screen will go blank. And then a few seconds later, it'll come back, and your job is to what? Was that what was that? You gotta there you go. That's right. You gotta remember what shape popped up in what place exactly. And as you succeed at the exercise and progress in the exercise, you're going to get more and more shapes that pop up that you have to remember, and you're going to get less and less time to remember them. Okay? It's a very simple idea. It almost reminds me of zone approximal development to some degree, if anybody knows the developmental literature, where you're just trying to increase the difficulty just enough, not so people can't succeed, but so you grow their ability just a little bit more every time. Okay? So this is an example of one of the cognitive exercises we do. I'm sorry I couldn't show it to you live. We do these exercises in a very different way, though, in cognitive enhancement therapy. Most of the cognitive remediation interventions that are available to help people with schizophrenia do something like this. Hi, Sean, how are you doing? You here for your CogRam session today? Yep. Okay, go ahead and have a seat, start up the program, I'll see you in an hour. Okay? Okay? And that's good in some way. It's very low resource, requires no real clinician intervention, only really an aid. But to us, it's not very therapeutically rich. And it also doesn't promote socialization. And it also doesn't promote engagement. And so in cognitive enhancement therapy, you don't do computer training alone. You do it with a buddy. All right? Anybody ever find going to the gym a little easier when somebody will go with you? Right? Anybody ever find this? Right? So at least I found this to be the case. It's much easier when you have a partner. And so we have two individuals who are affected by the condition working together. While one's working on the exercise, the job of the other one is to keep score for your partner. right? On a notebook, in a low-tech sort of way, so that there's real engagement. And gradually over time, the goal is to help these two individuals who get to know each other over the course of 18 months, 60 hours of this training, long time, is that they start to build a relationship, and they start to learn how to support one another, okay? In addition, in these sessions, you get a coach, right? You get a therapist who is there to help you problem solve, think strategically, and if you get stuck, is there to help you get unstuck, all right? And nobody in all the people we've ever worked with has ever gotten permanently stuck. All right? They've all been able to succeed and proceed through these exercises. Now, the social cognitive part of CET is much more difficult to represent. It's a group setting. And so what we do in the group setting, I can't show you for reasons of confidentiality, but it's a small group that has a very specific structure, and most of our group members consider it a class. It's not like a traditional therapy group. There's very little talk of emotion. There's a clear agenda. There's homework. And in fact, when members present their homework, one of the group members is in charge of chairing that presentation and calling both on other group members to present as well as coaches to give feedback. All right? And so there's ownership in this group. The people that are in this group also run this group. All right? And that's very important for engagement for individuals and also for empowerment. The content areas range from everything from basic psychoeducation on schizophrenia to understanding people's perspectives to reading nonverbal cues and much, much more. So that's cognitive enhancement therapy in a nutshell. Okay, it's a whirlwind tour through it. There's a 450-page manual if anybody ever wants light reading or an extra doorstop or something like this for the night, right? But it's an incredibly rich, lengthy approach. Now the question is, does it work? You know, I told you all about it, right? But what's the likelihood that this thing really works? It's very intensive. It requires a lot of effort. And I'll tell you what we know about whether it works or not, and I'll leave you to judge whether you think there's an evidence base behind it. The first trial was initiated and completed by Jerry Hogarty, my late mentor. It had 121 individuals who were randomized either to cognitive enhancement therapy. This was 2 years. This was back when CET was a full 2 years. We've since condensed it some. They were either assigned to cognitive enhancement therapy or an enriched supportive therapy control. Another very good intervention, but not one I have time to tell you about today. The important thing to know about it is it's an active control. Right? It was important to us to really try to give everybody who came in the study something that was valuable and beneficial, a good therapeutic component. That also makes it very difficult for CET to do better than the control as well. So it's a very stringent comparison for those of you who are trained in clinical trials. Because I know I'm speaking to a general audience today, I'll spare you of the methodological detail that came behind this figure. But this is a graph of effect size differences between the two conditions on many domains. I've been showing you effect size graphs already in this presentation. All right? If you remember, small is 0.2, medium is about 0.5, and 0.8 is large. Okay? The left-hand bars are cognitive enhancement therapy at 1 and 2 years, so they're stacked up like that. All right? The right-hand bars are enriched supportive therapy at 1 and 2 years, and they're stacked up. On the bottom are the domains that were assessed in the study. These are multivariate composite indices of lots of measures. It's past 5 o'clock. I won't bore you with them. But what do you notice in these figures? What do you notice about the left bars compared to the right bars? Yeah, that's the thing to notice. Right. They're pretty big. They're much bigger than the right-hand bars in many ways. Does anybody remember the average antipsychotic effect on cognition? Yeah. It's about there, right? What does 2 years of CET get you? 1.5 standard deviation improvement in cognition. That's one of the largest effect size we've ever seen in people with schizophrenia. Okay? It's very significant. It seemed to be driven in this sample of individuals who've been ill, chronic sample, I say, who've been ill with schizophrenia on average about 15 years. Okay? It seemed to really speed them up. Processing speed seemed to be the thing that really took off. And once people were able to process more quickly, many of the other cognitive domains also became much more effective and much more efficient. The other important point to take away from this graph is that these cognitive changes, these treatment effects, were not only realized on standardized neuropsychological tests, card sorting tasks, et cetera, they were also realized on meaningful areas of functional outcome, on social adjustment. This is a composite measure of social adjustment. Note, both groups did very well, although CET did better, and highly significantly better. This is a composite index of social adjustment that included vocational functioning, family functioning, social functioning, so on and so forth. If you break out the individual effects on these different functional outcome measures, as we were very interested in this, that's the goal for all of us in terms of what we're doing, is trying to move this functional outcome domain for people living in the community. If you break out these different domains among these individuals who'd been ill for about 15 years, you'll see that they had greatly improved social relationships, they had greatly improved family relationships, but they were not going back to work. They were largely going back to volunteer work if they were, but they weren't going back to competitive employment and paid jobs. And we asked a couple people why, and this is anecdotal. There's no evidence on this isn't published. But we asked some people why. And I'm sure many of you in this room know that there's in fact an active disincentive for people who have been on the disability system for so many years to go back to work. And in fact, many people that I see with schizophrenia aren't stupid. In fact, they know this. They know these things, all right? And they know if I go get a job at McDonald's or at the hospital doing clerical work, that's not going to pay for my antipsychotic medication. And so the benefits that we saw were more in volunteer work and more in social domains among these individuals than in vocational domains. That was concerning for us. We weren't happy to see that. So as part of our effort to try to understand how to address this issue, we started a new study. Now, before our new study, I got to get you this slide. This is a cool slide. So you have these effects, right, at the end of treatment. But what happens when treatment ends, right? That's always the question. And the historical effect when treatment ends, psychosocial treatment ends in schizophrenia, is that the gains that have been made are completely eroded and generally go back to baseline. Okay? So we followed these individuals for a year after to see, in fact, would these cognitive changes go back to baseline. The red lines are cognitive enhancement therapy. The yellow lines are enriched supportive therapy. We were able to get 103 of the 121 people back. So nice retention. Do any of these lines look like they're going down, really? In any major way? Broad maintenance of these effects for a year out. I'm going to show you another maintenance of these effects 10 years out in just a minute, and we'll see if they're maintained. It's not quite as rosy as 1 year as you might expect. These effects were maintained also in the social adjustment domain. But like I said, like I was getting ready to turn to, improvements in employment and other major work domains and major role domains that we were trying to address were not as prominently improved in this sample for a variety of reasons. It made us wonder if CET would work with people who've been ill for 15 years, why wait that long to give it to them? And why not try to help people sooner after they got ill? Maybe even before they're in the disability system, we could get them jobs, back to school, and they wouldn't have to worry about this disincentive that some of the other people that we were working with actively struggled with. So we started another study, a study of people in the early phase of schizophrenia, young individuals, treat to work with. It was our first venture into working with young people with this condition. This is the abbreviated consort diagram. There were 58 individuals randomized. The design was exactly the same as the first trial, randomized to either 2 years of cognitive enhancement therapy or an enriched supportive therapy control. Annual assessments thereafter. Well, the first thing that's important to realize is that young people who just develop psychosis don't want to come to treatment. Okay? I mean, this is a hard time for them. They're very ambivalent about treatment. They're not sure what to make of this condition. Despite that, we had over 75% retention in both of the treatment arms for this trial, suggesting that what we're doing in terms of people voting with their feet was acceptable. It's also important to mention that none of the individuals who were in these treatments were paid to come to the treatment. Some studies do this. We're philosophically against paying people to come to treatment. Eventually, if these treatments are to make it into the real world, people will be paying for them, not getting paid to come to them. And so they need to make that generalization and that leap eventually. We learned some interesting things with these young people, so much. It's taken us in a lot of directions. One is that when you've only had schizophrenia for a couple of years, or if you just developed it, the cognitive toll it takes on you is far less, right? So, in fact, that processing speed benefit that was so huge in individuals with chronic schizophrenia, there was no effect in young people with schizophrenia. And in fact, when we looked at their pre-treatment scores, the young people, their pre-treatment scores were better than individuals who had chronic schizophrenia and had been treated with CET for 2 years. Okay? Tells us something about just the toll this condition takes on the brain and the mind of people who are living with it and struggling with it. Nonetheless, we did have a significant effect on neurocognition, but it was paltry compared to the original study, and it's certainly paltry compared to some of the other domains that we moved in this early course study. Individuals, the real challenge for these young people was social, was understanding social situations and social cognition, and that took off like nobody's business in this study. This effect size, I wish it was in the same metric. This is percent improvement, but this corresponds to about 3-point standard deviation improvement, right? So by going younger, we doubled our effect size on social cognition, right? You could also say we cut our effect size on processing speed. But the real interest was, would there be an effect on employment and work? Now, CET, I've told you everything I have to tell you about the overview of CET. You did not hear a thing about it that focused on employment. It's a cognitive remediation program, right? Despite that, we had almost 60% of these young people working in competitive jobs for real work, for real pay by the end of this study, compared to about 20% in the control, right? So that leaves room for improvement. But that suggests that intervening on these cognitive challenges, it can produce meaningful and measurable improvements in not just cognition, but in functional outcomes in major ways. Other people like Susan McGurk have combined cognitive remediation with supported employment programs that are specifically designed to improve employment in this population, and have found incredible effects on the synergy between these two types of treatments. We're also very interested in that. We put out a paper recently that also suggested that among these young individuals, cognitive enhancement therapy improved their negative symptoms. That's a domain that's notoriously resistant to change. It's almost like these cognitive challenges. Antipsychotics don't change it. Social skills training doesn't change it. Assertive community treatment does. It's just so impervious to change. We're still trying to understand why this treatment is not directed towards negative symptoms at all. We're still trying to understand why those changes were observed and what exactly they mean. But we were nonetheless excited to see them. This is a one-year follow-up on social adjustment for these young individuals after they graduated the study, showing a broad maintenance. All right, so top line is CET, bottom line is enriched supportive therapy. And it shows a broad maintenance of the effect, at least for 1 year afterwards. This is 10 years afterwards. So the good thing about Pittsburgh, that's where I'm from, that's where I'm working, is nobody ever really leaves. All these people are still here. You know, I mean, it's like a neighborhood city, you know. In fact, you don't often leave your neighborhood. You don't often cross, I mean, there's like a million bridges to cross, but you kind of stay on your own bridge and everything. So it's actually feasible, without any interim funding, to propose a 10-year follow-up study among these individuals that we saw a decade ago and try to see how they're doing. And so this is 10 years out. The first 20 people that we've been able to get back. So it's not the full sample. These findings are very tentative. In fact, you're one of the first groups to see them outside of our program officials in Washington. But what you see here is this effect. The red lines are CET. Yeah, in fact, I didn't even label these graphs. Please don't take a picture of it. Right? They're very preliminary, and I don't want the data shared very much. So these effects, the red lines are CET, the blue lines are enriched supportive therapy. Neurocognition appears to continue growing as time goes on. That's an interesting phenomena that we're not sure what to make of. I'm actually in some disbelief about it. And so I have some people looking in to see if there's a data issue in this. They shouldn't still be growing. But one thing that appears to be true is they're not going down, right? One thing that appears to be true is they're not going down. Social cognition, that's the end of treatment. This is today. Okay? These young people really took to this and hung on to it for a long time. And I've been seeing them. We've been bringing them back to the clinic. I've been seeing them. You know, they're now They were 23 when they entered the study. You know, they're now 33, 35, something like that. And they're doing things that you don't routinely hear, sadly, people with schizophrenia do. Like one young woman I talked to just got back from her honeymoon, was on a cruise. I mean, she got married. Another gentleman just came in, said, well, what you been doing? What you been doing? I've been working. He's an engineer. How long you been an engineer? I got it right after I got out. You spend there the whole time? He's had that job for 10 years, the whole time since he got out. Now, not everybody has been like that, of course. Outcomes are variable. But the stories these individuals are coming in and telling us really suggests that intervening early with these types of approaches might significantly alter the disability trajectory of this condition, right? And that there is really no reason to wait 15 years before you give this to somebody. In fact, there's some urgency to give it to people very, very soon after they become ill. As part of this study, I worked with a colleague and visionary, Maciej Keshavan, who's a neuroscientist. And as part of this study, we assumed this is a cognitive remediation intervention. I told you we're trying to intervene on the brain. If we in fact are, we should be able to detect an effect, not in our elbow, but somewhere upstairs. All right? And so we scanned these individuals over the course of treatment every year that they came in. We're scanning them now at 10 years post as well. But this paper we published in 2010 shows that what we found, these top lines are CET and the bottom lines are enriched supportive therapy, the control. And what we found among people who received the control is what we so often see in young people with schizophrenia, is that there's a progressive loss of brain tissue. That as the years go by, living with this condition, you lose gray matter. What we found in CET was that this loss was erased. Yeah, there was no comparable loss in gray matter over the course of treatment, particularly in social areas of the brain, amygdala, fusiform gyrus, if that makes sense to anybody in the room. Right? And in fact, even in the amygdala, there was a little bit of growth, suggesting amygdala is a part of the brain that has a lot to do with emotion and social processing. And so it suggests that maybe even individuals are starting to grow neurons. We broadly considered this a neuroprotective effect, though I don't know if we quite have the evidence to suggest that we've grown neurons, that we've helped individuals grow neurons and replace perhaps what may have been lost or yet to develop. But this theme continues. Every area and every neural parameter that we look at, we find a detectable signal favoring CET. This is an effect on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is a very prominent area of the brain that's affected in schizophrenia. It's involved in working memory and executive function. You see this loss in EST, and you see a slight growth in cognitive enhancement therapy. Certainly not a loss. So we've protected against not only anatomical erosion, but perhaps functional erosion as well. This is a paper we just recently published in JSWR, which also suggests that not only does cognitive remediation help improve or protect against brain loss and help improve the way the brain functions, but it also helps the way the brain communicates. There's a new way I'm kind of a tech guy, so it's been fun learning all these things. There's all these new advances in neuroscience that tell us a little bit about how the brain talks to each other. It's called functional connectivity. Some people may have heard about this. Well, guess what? If you go through CET, on average, individuals improve the way the frontal part of the brain is talking to the middle part of the brain. So kind of the governor is talking to the social part of the brain. These things, which are traditionally disconnected, what we observe to be disconnected a lot in schizophrenia, start to become coupled again, the neural activity in them, suggesting that the impact of this intervention is perhaps at a deep biological level as well as a functional outcome level. I'll start to wrap up as I know we're getting short on time, and I certainly want to leave time for questions. But I think if you've taken nothing left from this talk, when you think of schizophrenia, please don't think of just hallucinations and delusions. Think about cognition. All right? That's part of the challenge. Is we're so used to thinking about, oh, stop talking to voices. Oh, yeah, that's your delusional issue. That's almost all we ever talk about with these individuals. Well, there's more going on here. And in fact, the evidence is just getting rid of hallucinations and delusions does not help community functioning very much. In fact, it appears that intervening at a cognitive level and in trying to improve some of the cognitive challenges these individuals experience it could be a much more powerful way to promote recovery and functional recovery in the community. Cognitive remediation is an evidence-based practice that social work has a role in. Right? Those of you in the room who are not neuropsychologists, please think of Cognition too. Right? I'm a social worker. I'm not a neuropsychologist. The inventor of this therapy was a social worker, not a neuropsychologist. Okay? We have a strong role to play in both development of these interventions, testing and evaluating them, and making sure they're implemented in the community. Okay? I think we can say at this point that cognitive remediation has an evidence base. It's an evidence-based practice. It's an evidence-based practice with a lot of heterogeneity, though. You know, with 38 programs, how can you tell people what to select? How do you know what to choose? How do you compare? So it's an evidence that's still evolving, but it's one that is promising, and I think we'll make it into the regs soon. You probably noticed on the CET slide that CET is the one cognitive remediation intervention that's been approved by SAMHSA as an evidence-based practice for the treatment of schizophrenia. And I think many more will start to come online as they develop more mature evidence bases. The other take-home, I think, from this work that's just so vitally important is that what we do, the psychosocial interventions that social workers have been developing, that we have been pioneering for so many years, they have hard biological impact. Okay? This slide right here is the first evidence that a psychosocial intervention can prevent brain loss in people with schizophrenia. Okay? There's now been several replications of this and new evidence emerging every day about these types of interventions and their benefits to the brain. And they're not a drug. Right? They're not a replacement for a drug at all. All the individuals in these studies were on antipsychotic treatment to control their positive symptoms, their biological vulnerability to stress. This was on top of the routine types of treatment individuals do. Nonetheless, despite them being a psychosocial or behavioral intervention, they have significant and meaningful impacts on the brain, which should give people renewed enthusiasm about the power of psychosocial interventions, not only to promote recovery, but to fundamentally change the neurobiology of this condition. Ultimately, I've been struggling with this a lot in our own work. Ultimately, now that we have an evidence base, we need people to be able to use this. And that's really a challenge, I think, I hope everybody in the room can hear. I receive weekly calls and emails from family members who want to be in CET or want to be in cognitive remediation. I've received some from Madison, and there's no programs available. Does anybody know of a cognitive enhancement therapy program here? Does anybody know of a cognitive remediation program available here? Yeah. So it took ACT quite a long time before it was taken up and really put into place widespread. We do ACT in Pennsylvania now. People do ACT in all the states now. Well, we want to try and make sure it doesn't take 15 or 20 years before this gets out to the people who need it. We want to try and implement this and get it out sooner. And I think part of that is both tailoring our interventions so that they're readily usable and accessible to community practitioners, raising awareness about the importance of cognition among community providers, and generally getting the word out to funders and payers. That only one of these interventions is approved as an evidence-based practice makes it very difficult to argue with policymakers and payers for reimbursement for these types of interventions. And these types of interventions are significantly more intense and more costly than what we're used to doing. Certainly more than supportive therapy every month. Right? This is 2 times a week, 3.5 hours, 18 months. That racks up a lot of money. But if you can show these kinds of outcomes, and as more of these get approved and recognized by our federal government, the hope is that payers will start becoming more supportive in helping our patients. So with that, thank you for your attention and your time, and be happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah, oh, sure. The question is, should you want to learn cognitive enhancement therapy or another cognitive remediation intervention, how would you get training in that? They have a first episode program, which would be great to have a CET program there. Well, you could contact us for training, and you could get on a wait list, and it probably would take 5 years for us to get you. Yeah. How long? 5 years. Yeah. 5 years? Yeah. The challenge with this is we're a research program, right? Our job is to develop clinical trials, right? So now we're starting to develop a training program because many people are asking for this, and a 5-year wait is ridiculous. It's not something people can wait for, and it's not something we want people to wait for. And so every time I hear a question like this, it just reminds me how important our training initiative is and why I'm so glad that we're starting it. So if you want training, please contact me, and I'll do my best to get you as quickly as we can. Okay. Thanks. You know, an 18-month intervention takes a long time to learn. You know, it takes a lot. Like we take on 1 or 2 training sites, and we're with them for 3 years before they really know how to do this. So we're doing 2 new things with cognitive enhancement therapy now. It's not that. One is with people who have addiction problems, because we know so many people with schizophrenia also have a comorbid addiction problem. And so that's been a really important initiative for us to start. And also, we're working in adults with autism. And if you want to hear more about that, I'll be at the Wasteman Center next month giving a talk on it. But we haven't gotten to older adults yet. Question. There's several threats to internal validity in these studies. One is CET is 3.5 hours, and EST is 1 hour. So there's a difference in intensity. In addition, EST is one-on-one individual, CET has a group and computer. In addition, the study assessors in the first 2 trials were not blind to treatment assignment, and so there's a possibility of assessor bias in that as well. We think that the likelihood of that influencing outcomes like competitive employment or neuropsychological tests is low, but it's still possible. In this follow-up study, we're doing a cost-effectiveness analysis now to try to understand, in the period of 10 years since they've seen us, what services have people used and how necessary has it been that they used costly services like inpatient and these types of things. And so that's kind of the direction we're trying to convince payers in. So I appreciate that feedback and support. It's an excellent question. So schizophrenia is a phasic condition. And what we know about this condition is you need to apply the right kind of treatment during the right phase of this condition. Cognitive enhancement therapy is not for people who are acutely psychotic and in the hospital. All right? In fact, it's likely that this intervention, being as intense as it is and demanding as it is, would make people worse in that state. Okay? And so cognitive enhancement therapy is when you've generally gotten your hallucinations and delusions under control. That doesn't mean they're absent. I've seen very few people living with schizophrenia have no positive symptoms anymore. But that means you're on a fairly stable medicine. You feel like you're probably not going back to the hospital very soon. Even those individuals, though, will still have breakthrough symptoms. And during the course of 18 months, you can almost guarantee it. At least one individual will have a breakthrough symptom. And so there's lots of things you can do to address that. What we've routinely done is give people breaks, timeouts, additional psychiatric help. It's helpful that our hospital is right up the street and can evaluate people pretty quickly. And so when we see people destabilizing or having an increase in positive symptoms, we roll back CET a little bit and start to focus on another type of intervention to address those. Oh, sure. There must be 7 or 8 trials in ADHD, children with ADHD, of cognitive remediation interventions. Most of them have been they've all been computer-based, none on focus on social cognition. They've almost always been either working memory or executive function training, and the evidence right now suggests that the benefits are limited. Benefits what? Limited. Yeah. It's actually one of the few populations that these types of approaches do not seem as beneficial.